Thanks everyone for joining this online session of the Religion and Society cluster at Nanyang Technological University. Let me introduce Professor Taylor Edis, who is today's speaker. Professor Taylor Edis works at Truman State University in the United States. He was born in Istanbul, Turkey, and earned his master's and PhD in theoretical physics at the Johns Hopkins University in 1994. Alongside his work in physics, he has also investigated a broad range of problems relating to the interface between science and religion and the public understanding of science. His books include Weirdness, What Fake Science and the Paranormal Tell Us About the Nature of Science, and An Illusion of Harmony, Science and Religion in Islam. He also edited Why Intelligent Design Fails, a scientific critique of the new creationism. I think that he continues to do very interesting work on the interface between science and religion, and also science and pseudoscience. So please join me in welcoming Professor Edis as today's lecturer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen. And here goes. Okay, so I'm assuming everybody's seeing this fine. Okay, so basically what I want to talk about, hold on. Right, so one of the things I do is I teach a course, not just on physics, but on science and fake science issues. And in fact, if you go around our department, you will find that I list myself not in physics, but in physics and weirdness. And I teach this course called Weird Science, and I talk about things like aliens, ghosts, Bigfoot, psychic powers, conspiracies, alternative medicine, and so forth. And one of the reasons for this is that a lot of scientists tend to be interested in these sorts of things. For example, if you're a physicist, you will typically at some point in your life get annoyed at quantum mysticism, the way that the word quantum in popular culture has become something of a substitute for magic. And of course, if you're a biologist, probably creationism is going to be a headache for you at some point. But my interest, especially my research interest for the last maybe 15 years, have largely focused on not so much criticizing the details of various fake science claims, but I'm interested in the question of what does fake science and the paranormal, what does it actually say about real science? What does it say about the nature of science? And so therefore, I'm interested in looking at some of the details, including a lot of the institutional and historical details that concern the development of certain fake scientific movements. And I have a background such that I've spent part of my life in Turkey, part of it in the United States. And both countries, interestingly enough, are homes to long-standing creationist movements. Both countries, Turkey and the United States, have very strong conservative religious influence on their local politics. And both the similarities and the differences between Turkey and the USA in matters of religion and creationism actually, I think, make them rather interesting case studies. And so, especially if you're someone like me and you're interested in questions like, why does somebody bother opposing evolution by creating an elaborate pseudoscience like scientific creationism? When does this happen? Because this is not necessary. There are other ways to oppose evolution. And especially in the case of Turkey, creationism actually has been very successful, much more so than the US variant. And so then the question becomes, what are the conditions that allow for success in opposing mainstream science, as in the creationist example? And also, another interesting comparison between Turkey and the United States is that in both countries, and indeed a lot of countries in the world, there's a political competition between two main political options that broadly we might call liberal and conservative, especially in American terms. And since creationism versus evolution in both cases has become a very politicized debate, invariably in examining the conditions that may be conducive for creationism, you have to look a little bit at the political landscape as well. So therefore, let me sort of quickly sort of sketch perhaps what kind of political attitudes people usually bring to creation evolution questions. Now, very often people who tend to favor science, people who hang around universities and things like that, tend to have an ideology of what you might call meritocratic liberalism. And liberals tend to think that natural science, as determined by the properly credentialed experts in the fields, people who hold PhDs and so forth, is by and large trustworthy. Liberals also tend to think that science education is therefore in the public interest and indeed in individual interests, that it improves your economic prospects and so forth. And perhaps more than anything else, liberals tend to think that science is a secular enterprise in the sense of being neutral between science and religion, between religious factions. However, in both countries, in both the United States and in Turkey, there's also a very strong, what you might call conservative populist political option, which tends to be the constituency which supports and favors creationism. And conservative populists generally have quite a different view of science itself, not just particular issues in science. Conservatives tend to be favorable towards technology, but they also tend to be a lot more reserved about more theoretical aspects of science, especially the sort of broad, overreaching conceptual frameworks in modern science, such as evolution. Also, conservatives tend to think that scientific expertise does not trump local forms of knowledge, which tend to be infused by, again, local forms of social morality. For conservatives, loyalties tend to be paramount rather than what you might call scientific considerations. And very often there's a perception in conservatives in both countries that scientific institutions are essentially a tool of ruling elites, and that elite scientific institutions are very biased concerning religion. So therefore, there's a certain amount of opposition there. And again, this is one of those key issues. If you get into the creation evolution debates in both countries, invariably you will run into charges that there's a lot of elitism on the part of people in established universities and so forth. And indeed, this is not entirely a made-up charge in the sense that in the United States and in Turkey, when you find that liberals are able to block creationism making inroads, for example, in education, usually this is because we can rely on rather elite interventions in institutions where expertise counts, where you intervene by adjusting the curricular standards rather than, say, more democratic school board elections and things like that. And indeed, in both countries, very often creation has been stopped not by democratic means, but by court orders. Particularly in the United States. It's the reason we don't have creationism in schools in the United States is essentially due to court judgments. And so therefore, conservatives often imagine themselves as putting forward a kind of a populist resistance against heavy-handed elites which impose their ideology from above. And the interesting picture is that in Turkey, the conservatives have actually succeeded politically more so than in the United States. In Turkey, to a certain degree, we have a picture of almost a counter elite displacing the more secular liberal elites in the country. And that affects the degree of success enjoyed by creationism when you compare the two countries. So let's look a little bit in detail about creationism in the United States, say. One of the things that's always been noticeable about the United States is that compared to other technologically advanced countries, the United States has been very religious. And even though lately the religiosity of the United States is declining, it's starting to secularize, it seems like, say, Western European countries, there still remains a fairly intensely religious cohort of especially evangelical Christians in the United States. And so creationism has always enjoyed large degrees of public support. For example, in Gallup polling, that's pretty much asked the same question since about 1980. We typically have about 45% support for creationism, about 45% for some sort of guided evolution, and only about 10% of people polled usually tends to agree with evolution as biologists understand it. Nonetheless, in the United States, creationism and variants such as intelligent design still are very much unacceptable in the intellectual high culture. There's very little penetration of creationism into public education, and creationism usually spreads more through informal channels, through private institutions and so forth, rather than large-scale public institutions. And if you look at, say, for example, polls about creation evolution in various different countries, these largely represent European countries with a smattering of Asian countries in there too. Blue represents agreeing with evolution. Red represents agreeing with creationism. And as you might expect, countries like Scandinavian countries and Japan and so forth have no problem typically with evolution. But if you look at the bottom of the scale, the last two countries in that particular international poll were the United States and Turkey, where in the United States, creationism and evolution have about equal number of supporters in the population. In Turkey, creationism actually has the upper hand. And it's been like that for a while. So if you look at more specifically about the Muslim case, because it tends to be lesser known, most of the somewhat reliable data come to us from stuff that was published around 2014-15 by the Pew Research Center in the United States. And when you look at what they have, you find charts sort of like this. Different religious groups tend to have very different responses to evolution. But if you look particularly at Muslims over here, they tend to be one of the groups that tend to be less supportive of evolution compared to, say, Buddhists and Catholics and so forth. On the other hand, if you look at specifically Muslim countries that was polled, and the question that was asked over here have to do specifically about human evolution, you tend to find that evolution and creation, usually there's about a 50-50 split. But in fact, this graph over here that they publish is actually very misleading because you have countries like Kazakhstan. It looks like you have about 80% support of evolution. That's because about half the population is Russian. If you look at Muslim populations, and if you look at very highly Muslim, high population countries like Turkey, like Pakistan, like Indonesia and so forth, you will find that the majority tends to be more creationist and tends to disagree with evolution. So clearly there's a lot of Muslim rejection of evolution. Muslims tend to reject evolution. Some of the reasons for this are obvious in that historically evolution has challenged conservative conceptions of religion. It tends to make it more difficult to hold to traditional supernatural beliefs. But there's more to it than that. Very often, evolution versus creationism ends up being a contest over the roles of expertise in public life. And what happens is that the creationists accept some expertise, particularly the expertise that's associated with technology and business, but also they want to affirm a sort of a religious populist political view, including the benefits of much of the modern world. Now, this is definitely true of the creationists in the United States. The creationists in the United States tend to be very pro-technology, very pro-free market. They very often make their living in a technology-oriented business environment. And this, by and large, in a broad brush description, holds true of Muslim creationists as well. Now, there's a variety of responses that you will find accordingly in Muslim countries towards evolution. So not every country is the same this way. Turkey, I mentioned, creationists have been very successful, but if you go next door to Turkey, to Iran, Iran is religiously very different. Iran is the center of Shiite Muslim belief rather than Sunni Muslim belief. 90% of Muslims the worldwide tend to be Sunni rather than Shiite. And Iranians actually tend to forthrightly accept non-human evolution, have no problem with it showing up in textbooks. And Iranians sort of have ambitions about developing biotechnology and making advancements in that area. What they tend to finesse is human evolution. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, as you might expect, as a notoriously Wahhabi fundamentalist-oriented country, Saudis tend to just reject evolution offhand, largely due to religious reasons. They're not so much interested in creationist fake science. The creationist literature that I've run into from Saudi Arabia tends to emphasize much more quotations from the Quran and religious reasons to reject evolution rather than trying to fake the science. In Pakistan, for example, another country where the majority tends to favor creationism, Pakistan actually tends to have evolution in their textbooks. What they do is they have a rather straightforward description of evolution in a secondary education level, but they start their chapters with Quranic quotations and they end their chapters with Quranic quotations and things like that. As long as you hide your science in enough of the Quran, it seems to be acceptable to the audience. Egypt, another important country and very populous country, there, if you look at public responses to education, to evolution, people tend to reject it, but it's more of a passive resistance to evolution that you see in Egypt. People tend to disagree with it because of religious reasons, but there isn't much of what you might call creationism going on, except for some few popular televangelists and so forth. So it's a very varied picture that you have in the Muslim world. And by and large, when I make general statements today, they largely apply to the Turkish example, which I'm most familiar with. Now, a very big sticking point in traditional Muslim belief about evolution is that human evolution tends to be very much unacceptable, mainly because there are Quranic stories about special creation, about Adam and Eve and all that sort of thing. So the way that many religious scholars get around this is that they tend to accept evolution for every living thing except for humans. And when it comes for non-human life, religious scholars tend to think of evolution as a divinely guided, intelligently designed process. And they will also throw in things like reinterpretations of Quranic verses and try and interpret these in a sort of a somewhat evolutionary fashion. So this is actually quite common, having a degree of acceptance of guided evolution. And very often, if you're talking about officially supported scholars, they tend to favor such views rather than outright creationism. But also, as I said, there's a lot of Muslim creationism. And then this brings up the question of, since there are many different possible religious responses for devout Muslims to evolution, why creationism in the first place? Yes, it's understandable that devout Muslims would have a certain degree of resistance to evolution, but why go to the trouble of creating an elaborate pseudoscience and making up all of this fake science, not just passively resisting evolution, not just resisting evolution on purely religious grounds, and maybe even just accepting official narratives from the official religious scholars that evolution is just a divinely guided process. So it must be attractive to many Muslims, at least a certain constituency of Muslims, as a way of harmonizing traditional religion and affirmations of modern technology. So part of this reason for the attractiveness of creationism for some people are historical. And this has a lot to do with the way that modern science has actually come to Muslim lands, largely as a foreign import. Just over the space of the last few centuries, most Muslims have found themselves in a situation of very rapidly having to adopt the new form of knowledge that developed largely in Western Europe. And what happened was that clearly the post-Christian West had a technological advantage, was able to colonialize Muslim lands because of an immense difference in military and commercial power. And this had roots in science. And therefore, Muslims almost invariably adopted the rhetoric of saying, hey, we need to bring science into Muslim lands. And creationism can work in such circumstances because it's kind of a way of affirming both science on one hand, the useful science, the kind of science that gives you power in military and commercial senses, but at the same time, affirming traditional beliefs as well. And what happens when you bring in creationist attitudes and so forth is that Muslims are able to then present a less Western image of science. The notion that they take only what is necessary from Western Europe, but preserve the local religious culture. And so therefore, I think that when you're looking at the popularity of creationism in some Muslim countries like Turkey, the reasons why this is so are mostly historical. And I think Turkish history is particularly illustrative in regard because Turkey actually used to be the most secular Muslim country. If you were talking about Turkey nearly 100 years ago. For example, this photo I'm displaying over here is from the 1930s. And the reason this is that before many European countries actually changed their system to allow women to vote and everything like that, Turkey did that. It's one of the leading countries in the world. And post the Turkish Revolution in the 1920s, Turkey went through a phase where there was almost a cultural revolution and more traditional forms of Islam were suppressed. But today, if you're to look at Turkey, the picture is very different. Today, the picture is going to be a much more re-Islamized kind of country. More traditional, more conservative forms of Islam in Turkey have had something of a cultural renaissance. And it is within that context that creationism in Turkey is now strong and successful. So again, if you want to go into a few more details, you're going to have to start going back to Ottoman times. And in the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, to which Turkey has become the successor state, in the declining period of the Ottoman Empire, when things are falling apart, in the late 19th century, they really faced this requirement that they needed to borrow technology very quickly, but also to guard against foreign cultural influences. And in the late 19th century, a debate started amongst Muslim intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire, particularly centered in Istanbul, but also in some Arab cities as well, in that the evolutionary ideas coming in from Western Europe at the time were often associated with the European science versus religion debate, and were wrapped in with materialist ideas like that of Ludwig Büchner, who were writing about this at the time. And obviously, for conservative Muslims, this was very much unacceptable, undesirable. So from the very beginning, in the Middle Eastern varieties of Islam, evolution has always been entangled with controversies over materialism and religious unbelief. So the response to Darwin in the Ottoman Empire was affected by this. The early response to Darwin and evolution was very much in the context of the rapid pressures to westernize the institutions of the country, and also elite debates over materialist philosophy. Very few people were actually interested in biology. It was really the materialist philosophy, the status of religion, that was the issue. It was not the only thing going on. At the same time, we see in some Arab countries, like in Lebanon, we have Western Protestant missionaries who are trying to reach Arab Christian populations. And they were sometimes the first ones to introduce evolution into the local picture. But that obviously did not address Muslims and tended to have a much more limited audience. And really, even with the very few extreme Westernizers who brought in Darwinian ideas and talked about it in places like Istanbul, they were largely ignored. A few of them were denounced as an offense to religion. One writer got sent away to exile on an island, but really it did not make much of a splash. Darwin was essentially ignored in the Ottoman Empire. And it really just accepted by a few radical secularizers, but not Muslim modernizers. However, due to its connection with the controversy over materialism, evolution still had some influence over a small segment of intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire, especially those connected to the imperial bureaucracy and the military. Especially the most extreme Westernizers tended to think that some of the more anti-religious philosophies from the West were actually a good idea, and evolution came wrapped up in that package. And indeed, the Turkish example is interesting because when these military and imperial intellectuals were able to taste power after the Turkish Revolution in the 1920s, Turkey actually became the most radical experiment in secularization in the Muslim world in the 1920s and 30s. And also in that same period, Darwinian evolution showed up in state science education. And indeed, in that period, state science education was a relatively new thing. And interestingly enough, in the 1920s and 30s, when evolution first starts appearing in evolution, you really don't see anything like a creationist response to that. Because it was only a very minor offense to traditional religion compared to the much more serious injuries to traditional forms of religion at the time, which were really officially suppressed. And you find a few scholars at that time sort of in official circles who promote the idea that evolution and Islam are compatible, but even they really don't have much effect on anything. Essentially, it just shows up in education and that's it. However, in the 1950s, the late 1940s and 1950s, things start changing. Because essentially the revolutionary generation in Turkey exhausted itself at that time. So Turkey went into a period of post-revolution conservatism, reaction against especially the policies about religion of the revolutionary era. And 1950s Turkey saw things like the formation of a parallel education system. So you started having normal secondary education in Turkey, but you also had a different religious education system, which were called the Imam Hatips. And they rapidly started growing and they started attracting a lot of support from the religiously conservative segments of the population. Also in the 1950s, you start seeing increasing influence by some grassroots modernizing religious movements who at first were led by traditional religious scholars, but then actually really changed the face of religion in Turkey. Particularly important over here is the Nur movement, the Nurcus, who were inspired by a modernist religious scholar called Said Nursi. And later on, in the following decades, the Nurcus would end up being at the forefront of creationism. They essentially brought creationism to Turkey. So still though, until about 1970s in Turkey, not too many people would have encountered creationism. They would have encountered resistance to evolution, yes, but they would not have encountered a sort of a pseudoscientific apologetic project like creationism. The rejection evolution that you had until about 1970 was really just passive rejection for religious reasons. But in the 1970s, you started seeing signs of creationism, small signs, but real signs. An Islamist political party, for example, in the early 19th century, in the early 1970s, entered a coalition government, and they started doing things like oppose evolution as a content in education in parliament. And this was their indirect way of opposing secularism. More importantly, the Nur movement actually started promoting creationism in their literature, especially the Gülenist branch of the Nur movement. And Fethullah Gülen, who was to become very influential in Turkey and indeed internationally, one of his first books was a creationist book. He thought that was very important for conservative Muslims to oppose evolution, and indeed to oppose evolution, not just on religious grounds, but also oppose it on scientific grounds. But the turning point really was 1980s. You started seeing some 1970s creationism, yes, but in 1980, Turkey underwent a military coup. And the generals who took power were very conservative, and they imposed a cultural policy of what they call the Turkish Islamic synthesis, and which actually included for the first time recognition and endorsement of creationism in official documents. And the successor to the military coup regime, starting from about 1983, was a conservative government who the generals just let take power. And in this conservative government, the Ministry of Education was controlled by Islamists. And at that time, they started making contact with the American Protestant creationists. They had official translations made from the US creationist literature and inserted these into school libraries and things like that. And again, in the late 1980s, you start seeing creationist paragraphs start appearing in Turkish textbooks in secondary education for the first time. So then in the 1990s, the creation evolution issue actually became something of an occasional media issue. It became part of the culture wars. Creationism appeared in books or not, depending on which political party controlled the Ministry of Education. But at the same time, much more importantly, the Gülenist segment of the Nur movement, they were a very interesting group in the sense that they had a project of what they said was creating a golden generation. And this was an idea of taking, creating a new elite. These were to be students who usually came from provincial and poor backgrounds, talented students, but also rather religious backgrounds. And they would support them in all sorts of ways. And the idea was to get a devout elite, educated particularly in the applied sciences like engineering, and these would form the new cadre of Islamist leadership in the future. That was their ambition. And in connection with that, you started getting a noticeable academic presence of creationism, because many people in education and science departments, particularly in new provincial universities in Turkey, had connections to Islam's political movements. And so you started seeing people even in science departments who would announce that they were creationists. Now, everything seemed to change for a brief time in 1997, where the military intervened in politics again, but this time they were worried about too much Islamist power. They intervened to get rid of the Islamists. So they forced the Islamists out of government. They downgraded the importance of the Imam Hatip, the parallel religious schools in the education system. And for a brief period, the textbooks became neutral between creation and evolution. It's not like they started endorsing evolution, they just became more neutral. But interestingly, at that same time, you have what is perhaps the most famous, internationally famous form of Islamic creationism appear. And this is the sort of what showed up under the name of Harun Yahya. And this was a more private sector, media-driven form of creationism. And suddenly, you had in Turkey, and spreading from that into the rest of the Muslim world, massive amounts of often very incoherent creationist literature made available for free to anybody who wants it. And Harun Yahya was a very interesting character. Now, Harun Yahya was supposed to be the pen name of this Turkish, what you might call cult leader, Adnan Oktar. Creationism was only one theme for the Harun Yahya people, but it was very central to their efforts. They usually promoted creationism in one chapter, starting out most of their books, especially early in their work. And Adnan Oktar, by the way, was always controversial among Turkish Muslims. He always had this reputation of being flashy, but somewhat not very trustworthy. But in any case, the Harun Yahya enterprise borrowed massively from Christian creationists, particularly the United States, but borrowed and adapted them to more Islamic themes. The signature of the Harun Yahya enterprise was its use of media. It was very savvy about its use of media. And it invariably projected this image of being modern, but religious as well. So this is a picture of Adnan Oktar that you have on your screen. Invariably, his image was someone in very smartly dressed in modern form, posed on his yacht, giving this image of a very rich, very successful, in many ways very westernized, but also at the same time very traditionally devout person. So this is an important point. Creationists are not traditional Muslims. They're not traditionalists, they're modern Muslims. The movements, the religious movements who have supported creationism are in fact notable for that. The Nur movement is famous for its non-traditional authority structure in religion. They don't work based on the old type of religious scholarship. They have a very modern orientation. They're very pro-capitalist in development, and they really very much embrace modern technology. Indeed, that's part of the reason why Adnan Oktar projects this modern image of the Western clothes and the financial competence and everything like that. The message they're trying to present is that they've mastered the modern world, but they've remained devout, and they can challenge materialists even in modern science. It's a thoroughly modern movement, as I said. So, as I mentioned, Harun Yahya's influence did not stay confined to Turkey. Especially in the early 2000s, it made a bid to try and acquire international influence. And indeed, there was a time when I could say, for example, step into an Islamic bookstore in London, and I would be sure to find lots of Harun Yahya literature. Again, in the early 2000s, Harun Yahya tried to penetrate into your area of the world, because Harun Yahya started going into Indonesian and Malaysian markets. And Indonesia and Malaysia actually is an interesting, there are also centers of creationism in the Islamic world right now. You find many creationists, indeed many scientists based in Indonesia and Malaysia who are promoting creationism right now. And so there was a sort of a natural connection to be made with the Turkish creationists. And Harun Yahya was one of the first people who did that. But again, in the early 2000s, he had publicity stunts. Like he sent this massive atlas of creation to the mailboxes of scientists in North America and Europe, and basically reap the publicity rewards. In 2010 in Jordan, Adnan Oktar was listed as one of the 50 most influential Muslims alive. Now, another example in the 2000s of the creationist influence in Turkey has nothing to do with Adnan Oktar. Really, Adnan Oktar was a bit of a sideshow. What was much more important in Turkey was the institutionalization of creationism in Turkish institutions. So the AKP government, under the leadership of Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey still, they took power in Turkey. They're an Islamist political party, a moderate Islamist political party. And they proceeded to do their long march through the institutions. And in their period, creationism really became entrenched in textbooks. They still are. The Ministry of Education has been reliably hostile to education. And it's been successful creationism in Turkey. There have been polls that show that creationism has caught on with the public, with undergraduates, and so forth. So it's doing its work. And indeed, for some reason, in 2009, for example, again, if you follow the science news, you may have actually run into that. In 2009, because of Darwin's 200th year of his birth, the major science magazine of Turkey decided to put out an issue celebrating Darwin. And on the left there, you see the original proposed cover for the issue. But the political appointee in charge of the Turkish equivalent of the National Science Foundation intervened, and they changed the cover. They really don't want to touch evolution. However, fairly recently, there was an interesting development that actually affected the Turkish political scene, and therefore creationism as well. In 2015, there was a fallout between the Erdogan, the AKP in charge, and other Islamists, such as the Gülenist branch of the Nur movement. And they started fighting one another to such a degree that in 2015, the Gülenists, who had actually infiltrated the army to a considerable degree, actually tried a coup attempt. And in the coup attempt, I mean, it was an incompetent coup attempt. After that, Erdogan and people around him responded by having a full-scale purge of Gülenists from Turkish institutions. They intensified the re-Islamization of the country, essentially moved towards a form of one-man rule. And this affected education policy too, in particular favoring the religious school system over secular schools. In 2017, the effects of that in Turkish education was evolution was completely removed from the secondary curriculum in Turkey. The reasons that they offered was that evolution was supposed to be too controversial, too hard to understand, and therefore they would not introduce evolution to students before the college level. Really what was happening was, with the coup attempt as a pretext, the AKP purged all opposition from Turkey, the secularist opposition along with Gülenists, from higher education as well as all levels of public education. But weirdly enough, at this time, Adnan Oktar, the big flashy private sector creationism in Turkey, also ran into trouble. At that point, the Hari Yahya enterprise, Adnan Oktar, had degenerated into a really weird thing. Largely what they were doing was televangelism. And the kind of televangelism was doing involved lots of rather scantily clad women bouncing around, which is not exactly what you expect from a conservative Muslim organization. So he was very controversial because of that. And Adnan Oktar had always been suspected of being something more of an organized crime figure more than a religious figure. So the AKP government attacked the Adnan Oktar network as a crime network and essentially convicted them of extortion and mafia-like activities, arrested Oktar, and basically and now he's been convicted and probably is going to spend the rest of his life in jail. Still, as I said, the important thing in Turkish creationism is not so much Adnan Oktar, but the way that creationism has penetrated Turkish institutions. Indeed, provincial universities right now in Turkey are very supportive of creationism. They are kind of cultivating a politically reliable, religiously conservative, alternative forms of expertise, especially in the new universities where they have a lot of influence in the personnel. I'm flashing on the screen right now a couple of posters for a series of international creationism conferences that they've organized. The latest one was from October of last year. And these are your basic academic conference. They last for a couple of days. They run parallel sessions. They have speakers from all over the world. They have speakers from multiple academic departments, not just theology departments, but also engineering, natural science, science education departments, and everything like that. all denouncing evolution and supporting creationism. And these conferences are hosted by state universities, and they fully enjoy state support. So we have something like what I might call a Turkish model of Islamic creationism right now. And an interesting question is whether this type of the Turkish model of Islamic creationism is going to be influential in the rest of the Muslim world. And it's really uncertain, because clearly basic creationism, opposition to evolution as an apologetic form, does appeal to Muslims globally. I mean, there is no shortage of televangelists and YouTube video people and everything like that you find from all over the Muslim world who are denouncing evolution and advancing some form of fake science that supports creation. However, what's really distinctive about Turkey is the institutional nature of creationism, the wide degree of success that creationism has enjoyed in Turkey. And creationism in other parts of the Muslim world need not follow the same model. They need not have the same kind of elaborate pseudoscience, and it's not at all certain that they're going to be able to take over institutions the same way as they have done in Turkey. That very much remains to be seen. However, if we're going to speculate about that, I want to return to the original theme that evolution and creation are always very much political disputes rather than, say, intellectual disputes. And so it's very important to note that these are all decades, recent decades, has been a time of the rise of right-wing populist forms of politics around the world. And it's not just a Christian thing, it's not just a Muslim thing, it also involves, say, Hindu nationalism in India and so forth as well. Now, going back to the United States example, right now, right-wing populism gets votes. Trump, to a certain degree, was a right-wing populist phenomenon, but right-wing populism in the United States is still very much excluded from the intellectual high culture, from the institutions. You won't find much creationism in US universities. But on the other hand, it's politically strengthening, so who knows what's going to happen. In Turkey, in contrast, right-wing populism has been very successful. They've taken power and managed to hold on to power for 2 decades right now, and they've managed to transform the institutions of the country. So what I'm trying to hint at is that, yeah, religious beliefs contribute to creationism, but there are a lot of political details that matter if you're trying to understand creationist movements. And so let me close by referring back to a slogan that's become popular in the United States in this pandemic era when we're having lots of trouble with anti-vaxxers and things like that. A common slogan that you find among liberals in the United States is trust the science. Well, we even have marches for supporting science, and we hold up posters like "In Science We Trust." I've even joined a couple of them myself. And we find that in the United States, right-wing populism is very often involved not just with creationism, it's also climate change denial and also resistance to pandemic measures and things like that. Interestingly enough, there's a good deal of that going on in Turkey as well. And the main theme, political theme over here, has to do with distrust and expertise. This attitude of denouncing elites and perceiving science as an elite instrument. And honestly, I have a difficulty figuring out what might be the best way to respond to this. Because very often it seems the instinct of liberals has been to adopt a kind of a politics where you demand not just trust in science, but trust in all professionals, all forms of expertise. But that has its own dangers. Because one of the reasons that has supported the growth of right-wing populism is that many of the forms of expertise that we have is actually quite predatory. Does trust the science means trust in economists, lawyers, management consultants? Are we arguing for a technocratic form of government? It's really not quite clear what the response to right-wing populism and associated science denial is really going to be. So I'll kind of leave it over there. Thanks for listening. If you want to get some more details about my arguments concerning such topics, maybe my last 2 books are good places to look. If you're particularly interested in the Islamic angle, my 2016 book, Islam Evolving, addresses many of these topics. And if you're more interested in not so much the Islamic angle, but treating creationism and similar forms of fake science as a device to do some interesting philosophy of science, then my latest book, Weirdness, that might interest you. So I will just leave things there. I will stop sharing the screen, and I hope we'll get some interesting questions.